I guess participate's not the right word. We are going to watch a pre-recorded lesson. Several months ago, it seems now, we recorded the Teen Leadership Conference. Now, that was supposed to happen in August, but due to everything that's going on, that did not happen. But while David Shannon was here, he recorded an extra lesson entitled Encouraging Our Youth. And I've been trying to find a slot to put this in on Wednesday evenings for some time. It is a fantastic lesson. It's about 34 minutes long, so it will fit out perfectly in the way we will do our class tonight. But what I want you to do as you go through the lesson, be listening for some key points, especially, and I'm not going to tell you exactly what he says. You find it in that lesson. But there's a point where he talks about tears, and he's going to ask you a question about tears as he goes through this lesson. Find that point and see if you can answer that question with a yes or no. And he kind of talks about how that question's a little bit unfair, but it really makes a strong point for us as we go through. And then once he is done, he'll be done right at the end. We'll have some concluding comments about that lesson tonight before our children get back from the back classes. But we will participate in this lesson on the screen, as well as everyone who's watching with us online at home. They'll be able to see it just as it happens with us tonight. So Chris is going to slide that over there, and they're going to get everything ready to go. And then once we finish the lesson, remember, we'll have some concluding comments together tonight.
We have many great resources in the Lord's church, but do we have any greater than our young people? They're full of energy. They have so much to offer today, but even for the future. When we look in a chronological way, they are the future. Now, yes, they are the church of today as well, but what can we do to empower them now so that they will lead lives that are faithful to God? They'll be healthy spiritually themselves. What can we do to empower them so that they will lead lives that are healthy for their family? They'll be good family members, faithful Christian husbands and wives and mothers and fathers. What can we do to empower them so that they also will be great Christians in the community, in the workplace? That they will be wonderful brothers and sisters in the Lord's church. They'll grow to be the future elders and elders' wives and deacons' wives. They'll be the future preachers and ministers and wives of those ministers. They'll be the teachers. They'll be the leaders of ministries. What is it that we can do to empower them to accomplish this? Well, our challenge is not only to empower them to accomplish this, but to avoid the other extreme. You know, many studies today reveal that in the Lord's church, we lose anywhere from 40 to 60% of our young people once they leave high school. As a matter of fact, if we were just looking at one of the most difficult ages to be a Christian, just based upon how many leave, we would have to say somewhere around 18 or 19 years of age, at least here in the United States of America. It is a very, very difficult age to be a Christian. One of the greatest challenges we have is not just empowering young people. One of the greatest challenges we have to empower them in such a way that they even have faith after high school. So how do we do this? I think about one time when I was doing an internship when I was in college. It was out of state, and I was staying with a family, and they had several teenage sons. And one particular morning, I was in the kitchen. Two of the sons were already at the table eating. They were strong, healthy young men, over 6 feet tall. They were athletic. One of them even went on to play NFL football. And I was in the kitchen in the refrigerator getting something out of the refrigerator, and the phone rung. And during this conversation, you could only hear the mother's end of the conversation, and it was mostly just words and phrases, and you couldn't tell anything what she said. Be like, who is this? When? Where? Where is he now? Just quick questions and clarifications such as that. She hangs up the phone and she looks in the direction of her sons eating, and she looks past them and she mentions the name of one of their brothers, and she says, Dustin is dead. And one dropped a utensil out of his mouth. You see, this family had already had one teenager to pass away. And so now they chimed in, Mom, what happened? What happened to him? And she said, he's dead. And they said, but how? What happened? And she said, he's dead spiritually. Oh, they began to loudly rebuke her. Mom, you scared us, they were yelling. You shouldn't do that. We thought you meant he was really dead. And she looked at them right in their eyes and she said, he is really dead. Your brother is spiritually dead. Later, I asked her, a few weeks later, we knew each other very well, and I asked her, I said, which is harder? You've had a child that was a very faithful Christian to die physically, and now you have a child who is not a faithful Christian, and so they're dying spiritually, but they're still alive physically. I said, which one is harder? Without any hesitation, she said, oh, it's so much harder watching my son who is alive physically be dead spiritually. She said, my other child, I know exactly where they are. And I know that I will see them again one day, and I know the great reward they have. I give you that story to simply ask you, do we see spiritual death for what it is? You know, back to that statistic, if we really are losing somewhere around 50% of our young people and they're dying spiritually, would we be more concerned if our 18 and 19-year-olds were dying physically at the rate of 50%? How many of us would be throwing our arms in the air and be saying, we have to do something about this? We have 50% of our young people dying. This is too many funerals. How many of us have our hands in the air declaring, we have too many young people dying spiritually. We have to do something about this. Listen, we know that the way to do something about this is not just to avoid spiritual death. The way to do something about this is to empower our young people to grow closer to God so that when they're graduating from high school, they have a foundation of faith that has become their own. Their commitment is not just a reflection of their family or the congregation that they've been a part of, but their commitment is their own commitment to Jesus Christ. What is it that we can do? Again, I believe with all my heart I'm speaking to a congregation that you want to accomplish this with 100% success rate. I wish I had just a real simple, easy answer to say, we do this and it will work every time. But as I always want to look for answers in the Word of God. And so when I thought about this, I thought about what examples do we have of an older generation, if you will, reaching back and helping to empower a younger generation. Paul and Timothy, they are about the best examples we have in Scripture of one generation empowering another generation. If you have your Bibles, I would like for us to read in 2 Timothy, the 1st chapter. By this time, Paul is an older man. You probably remember that 2 Timothy 4. By this time, Paul literally writes and says in the 4th chapter, the time of my departure is at hand. In other words, he knows that he's about to die. And what does he do? Out of everyone he could turn to, he writes a letter to this man that's much younger than him, but a man that he loves dearly. He reaches out to Timothy. But he reaches out to Timothy and he says some things to him, especially in the 1st chapter and throughout this short epistle, that's very straightforward. You know, you can almost read it and say, wow, does he really have the right to say that? And the answer is yes, because he started reaching out to Timothy and helping him in his spiritual journey back when Timothy was probably a teenager. And they've maintained that role of him being like a spiritual father to him and being a mentor to him and helping Timothy along. And as their relationship matured, Timothy would also help Paul and help him in his mission work. And so what I'd like for you to see is I'd like for us just to read the first 7 or 8 verses in our study tonight of 2 Timothy, the first chapter. And I'd like for us to see this relationship that Paul describes and how he addresses Timothy. And surely there's some things in here that will help you and I as we seek to make a difference in young people's lives too. The first thing I would say to you is that when we read this, we realize that Paul had a genuine relationship with Timothy. In other words, when I say to you, we need to figure out how to reach back and help the younger generation, I'm not talking about just like a quarter-long program where you say, hey, I want a program where every adult writes to a young person and tells them what they wish they knew at their age. I'm not opposed to those little exercises that helps educate a young person. So if you're doing that, continue doing it. I'm just saying to you, that's not what we're studying tonight. What we see in this passage is we see that Paul intentionally formed a genuine relationship where they truly knew each other well, and they walked together with each other throughout the rest of their life. And it began when Timothy was a teenager. So when we read in 2 Timothy, the first chapter, we see in verse 1, Paul identifies himself as apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God according to the promise of life which is in Christ Jesus. And he addresses it to Timothy, a beloved son. Now that's interesting that he calls Timothy a beloved son when we're almost certain there's no biological kinship there. The only reason he calls him a beloved son is because their genuine relationship had become so strong over time, he can't help but refer to him as being like a son. Maybe you have someone in your life that you're so close to them, when you introduce them, maybe you say, oh, this so-and-so, he's like a brother. Paul would look at Timothy and say, yes, this is Timothy. He's like a son. Or he would write a letter to Timothy. Timothy would open the letter, and what is one of the first things he would say? To my beloved son. See, not just son, beloved. Beloved means to love much. He's saying immediately, Timothy, I love you much. Now, I want you, as we study this tonight, I want you to think about this from the standpoint of if you're a grandparent, how could you encourage your children, your grandchildren? But I want everyone that's listening to this to also consider this from another standpoint. What could you do to reach back to someone who is not related to you, like Paul did? And say, I not only want to encourage my physical family, I want to expand that, and as a brother and sister in Christ who's a little bit older than the generation behind me, or maybe several generations back, and I want to reach out and I want to encourage more than just my physical family. Why? Because we want to be a church that empowers all young people. Now, I would also say to those of you who are young people, do you realize that the only way you can grow spiritually from the benefit of the older generation helping you is if you're willing to? So what we're studying tonight, if you will, is a two-way street. The older generation has to be willing to be a mentor. The younger has to be willing to be mentored by them. And so the question is, would you be like Timothy that was willing for Paul to make investments into his life? And so you say, well, what would this relationship look like? Well, let's just take the characteristics that are described in the next few verses. We've just read verse 1 and the first part of verse 2. I'd like for us to go into verse 3 and think about these characteristics. He says, I thank God whom I serve with a pure conscience as my forefathers did, as without ceasing I remember you in my prayers, night and day, greatly desiring to see you, being mindful of your tears, that I may be filled with joy. Now, isn't this interesting that when he called him a beloved son, he went on to say, son, I never cease to remember you. I think about you often. Son, I pray about you night and day. And son, I especially am mindful and prayerful about the things that have brought tears to your eyes. And son, I can't wait to see you again the next time we can get together. You might think that's a little more natural if you were saying that to your grandchild. But again, I want to ask you that are young people, do you have someone older in your life that knows you that well? Older people, do you have someone younger than you that's not related to you except through the blood of Christ, that you know them that well? You see, it's not a program where you say, hey, here's a name, will you pray for them? This is a natural, genuine relationship. When Paul writes, he says, I just naturally pray for you night and day. In other words, that's the way to say without ceasing. I pray for you all the time. Oh, and by the way, I'm mindful of the tears. Now pause there for a moment. How did Paul know what had brought tears to Timothy's eyes? If I ask any of you older people tonight, when is the last time one of the teenagers in your congregation has shed tears, and why were they crying? Probably the answer we would get most of the time would be kind of a confused look and be like, how am I supposed to know? And it kind of makes the point, doesn't it? How are we going to have life-changing empowerment in the lives of young people if the only people that know them really well are people their age? Listen, we all need peers around us that are faithful Christians. But we all need individuals that are older than us also, that we can look up to, and they know us so well that they can lead us through difficult times. I want to remind you again, there's something about being 18 or 19 years old in America that our children that are going into young adulthood do not do it very well. About half of them lose their faith, and most of that half never come back again. How can we be there during that time to help them if we've never formed a genuine relationship? What if that letter is from you and you're writing an 18-year-old that now has gone into the full-time workforce, or they've gone into the military first full-time, or they've gone to college full-time. And so you're going to write them a letter, and you write it and you just can't help but say, my beloved son or my beloved daughter, because you're so close. You have been close to them for years. They're not related to you. It's just you have nurtured them spiritually. You have gotten to know them. And because you know them so well, you can honestly say to them, I mention you in my prayers every day. And you can also, because you know them so well, say, I know what you're struggling with, and I want to give you some encouragement. I want to give you some guidance. I know what's been bringing tears to your eyes. Oh, and by the way, as he says here, I desire to see you. I can't wait till the next time you come home. Let's go by and let's get a milkshake. Let's get coffee. Let's get dessert. Let's get a meal together. I really look forward to spending time with you. Church, are you listening? How different would our congregations be? And how much fewer young people would lose their faith if our young people would allow relationships like that to be developed? And our older people, those in their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, 90s, those people would take the time to build a relationship. You see, the relationship we're talking about, a person can't do that with everybody in the youth group, because we're talking about a relationship that's real. It takes a large investment of time, and one that you're not just taking on for a quarter, you're taking on for the rest of your life, because it's a real relationship. You see, if everybody in the church was just reaching back to one or two or three others, can you imagine how different it would be? Well, what did he want? In that relationship, what was he trying to accomplish? I think he begins to speak to that in the very next verse, and I take you to verse 5. He says, when I call to remembrance the genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded it's in you also. I'll be honest with you, for a lot of years I didn't know exactly what to do with that verse, because it just sounds like, at first reading, It sounds like that he's simply giving a report of the faithfulness of Timothy's family. And the reason that seems so strange to me is because why would Paul give Timothy a report about the faithfulness of Timothy's family when Timothy would know that even better than Paul? Timothy must have had an amazing grandmother and mother. And when I say amazing, I mean in the faith. He knew that. He grew up around them. This same book tells us they were the ones that taught him Scripture from a child. Listen, from a little bitty boy, he was taught to love the Lord. He was taught to love the Scripture, to be obedient, to be faithful. And he got that from his mother and his grandmother. And Paul comes along and he sees them and he sees Timothy and he says, I know about the genuine faith that's in your family. But why does he turn around and say then, oh, and I'm persuaded it's in you also? I want to ask you something. Have you ever had a time in your life where you looked yourself in the mirror and you finally just kind of broke? And you honestly said to yourself, how did I get here? I didn't think I'd ever be doing what I'm doing right now, and ashamed of it. I'm ashamed of it. I didn't think I'd ever be the person I am now. I can't believe I've allowed myself to become this. Let me interrupt this to say this. I'm going to guess here that if you could have gone up to Timothy a few years before this time in his life, and you would have said, Timothy, will you ever be ashamed of Paul? He would have said, me be ashamed of Paul? Do you have any idea what Paul's done for me in my life? I mean, I met Paul when I was a teenager and he took me on that missionary trip. Wow, he invested in me and he has loved me like a father would love a son. I can't say enough good about Paul. No, I would never be ashamed of him. Oh, Timothy, would you ever be ashamed to just preach the gospel? No. Do you know how much the Lord has done for me? From the time I was little, I have been taught about the Lord. I've known the Holy Scriptures. I can genuinely say to you, I love Jesus. As a matter of fact, I love Him so much, I would die for Jesus. Why do you ask? Now fast forward a few years. Isn't it interesting how throughout a lifetime, you and I will go through periods of highs and lows. I want to take your eyes down to verse 7 and 8. And I want you to imagine that Timothy was in some kind of position that Paul, his great mentor, his father-like figure, felt the need to say this to Timothy. Verse 7, for God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Therefore, do not be ashamed of the testimony of our Lord, nor of me, His prisoner, but share with me in the sufferings for the gospel according to the power of God. Can you believe that his mentor, his one that's like a spiritual father to him, felt the need to write to him at this time? But you see, times probably had started getting to be very heavy and very serious. Can you imagine? It doesn't take long to say 2 + 2 = 4. Timothy knows that Paul is writing to him from prison. He even says here, I'm waiting to be executed, but I'm ready for this. Timothy's a much younger man than Paul. Can you imagine what he's thinking? Wait a minute, Paul is about to be executed because he's a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I am one of Paul's close associates. Everybody knows Paul and Timothy. If I continue to identify myself closely with Paul, and I continue to preach the same gospel that Paul is preaching, and he's waiting to be executed now, how long will it be before I'm the one waiting to be executed? Paul writes a letter, and he tells him that spirit of fear didn't come from God. And it tells him not to be ashamed of him and his chains or of the testimony of the Lord. But here's what I don't want you to miss as we go back up to verse 5. You remember we were just talking about the fact, was he just giving a report? Oh, let me tell you about the faith of your mother, the faith of your grandmother, and I'm persuaded it's in you also. It wasn't just a report. It's the time when someone older than you, and this is why young people need faithful Christian friends that are a season or 2 or 3 ahead of them in life. Friends with someone that's already walked that path. Paul had already walked the path of being a younger man who is living the Christian life and being persecuted. And I know sometimes we might picture in our mind that Paul never went through any difficulty, but I would say to you that Paul was challenged just like any other human that would be persecuted would be challenged. And so now he writes back to Timothy and think about it. He's able to empathize with Timothy as if to say, I've been there too. I know how hard it can be sometime. I know how difficult it can be sometime. But I want to tell you something, and it's as if he's saying, I know something about you that you don't know about you. You're looking at yourself now and thinking, I can't do it. You're looking at yourself and saying, I'm losing my faith. You're looking at yourself and saying, I seem to be stumbling all over myself. I'm just trying to read between the lines here. Instead, he writes to him and says, as your mentor, I know who you are. And I want to tell you, son, I believe in you right now probably more than you believe in yourself. I want to tell you what I'm persuaded of. That great faith that your grandmother had and your mother had, I want you to know I'm persuaded it's in you also. Wow. When someone we love, someone who has invested so much in us, and they know us so well, and they can tell us, you've got this. I see what you can do even before you see what you can do. I see the burden you're going to be able to carry better than you even see the burden that you're going to be able to carry. I want to encourage you to think about those young people at 18 and 19 years old. What if they had a Christian writing to them that's able to say to them when that Christian knows that they're not making the best of choices? They've gone off to college and they've stopped going to worship. They've gone off to college and they've stopped their great devotion to God. Who is going to have the relationship to be able to write a straightforward letter and say, I know who you are. I know you can do better than this. And listen, if no one's built that relationship, we're going to continue losing 40, 50, 60% of our young people. I'd say to you that the 40 or 50 that we do keep, it's because someone has formed that relationship with them. Well, what would that relationship do? It would stir them to realize they can have the faith. But look in verse 6. Therefore, I remind you to stir up the gift of God which is in you through the laying on of my hands. Remember, Paul here is referring to the fact that he laid his hands on Timothy at some time in his life and gave him a spiritual gift, probably a miraculous gift. But whatever it is, it was a spiritual gift. And he knew that he had it, but he also knew that he wasn't using it with a fervency. He wasn't using it with an urgency. He wasn't faithful with it, apparently. And he says, notice, he didn't say, I can stir it up. Paul can't make Timothy be stirred up. But notice what he did say. He then said, therefore, I remind you to stir up the gift. Son, I want to fan that flame. But the reality is, I'm going to have to remind you, you need to fan that flame. I can't do it for you. But I tell you this, beloved son, I know you have tears in your eyes. And I've been praying every day about it. But it's time you understand what you're capable of. I'm persuaded that strong faith is still in you. And I'm reminding you, you need now to fan the flame and get back to serving with a genuine service. He's built this genuine relationship to talk with Him about His genuine faith and about His genuine service so that he can have genuine courage to continue serving when the way grows difficult. And that genuine courage is what we've already read, but I'll read it again. Verse 7. He says to him, think how meaningful it was for Paul to say this to Timothy. Timothy could hear this from others, but think about when he hears it from Paul. For God has not given us. I've been persecuted. You're going to go through persecution. Let me tell you what God didn't give us during this time. He didn't give us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Timothy, fear will paralyze you. Fear will stop you in your tracks from doing the right and the courageous things. God gave us the spirit of power. God is greater than anything we face. Team up with God. God gives us the spirit of love. God's love is great. God gives us a spirit of a sound mind. Do you realize when we really are afraid, we will usually say things like this: I just don't know what to do. I just can't think clearly. Why do we not know what to do? We do not have a sound or a clear mind. But God gives us a clear mind. He tells us how to act, how to be courageous, how to be faithful. But so oftentimes what we also need is not only God, but we need some of God's people that have walked that path before and are able to say, listen, I've been around that curve in the road. I've been around that difficult hill down and even the difficult climb back up. Son, I know where you are, but I want you to know this. I know you can do it. Now fan the flame. Don't let fear stop you. And son, remember this. You're beloved to me. Son, remember this. I don't ever cease praying for you. I don't cease remembering you. You're always on my mind. You're always in my prayers. And son, I'm sorry for the tears that's been streaming down your face. Son, don't be ashamed of the testimony of the Lord. Have you ever received a letter? It just hit you. You read it. You wiped some tears. You closed it. You went back and you opened it again. You read it again. You laid it down. You came back an hour or two later and you read it again. The next day you picked it up and you read it again. Listen, you know that I don't know what Timothy did when he read this first paragraph of 2 Timothy, the first chapter. But I want to remind you, this was a letter delivered to Timothy. I can't imagine how many times Timothy must have picked this letter up and read this section, wiped the tears, and read it again. It gives me cold chills to think about how Timothy would have gotten up and said, that faith is in me. I serve a great God. I want to be faithful to Him. Let me fan that flame. Let me get to work for the Lord. I love the Lord. I know that God is greater than anything I face. He'll give me not that spirit of fear. I'm not ashamed of the Lord. I'm not ashamed of Paul. But what if Timothy had not had a Paul in his life? Church, empower young people. And may God bless us all in that task.
Did you see the point about the tears? I thought that was really interesting. These were recorded, if I remember the correct date, on July or June the 20th. I realized as soon as I said that, I don't know what month it was. It was the day of the 20th, and that was a Monday. So whatever month had a Monday that was the 20th, these were recorded. And David Shannon recorded 3 lessons back to back all the way through. First 2 lessons were the TLC lessons that are in the 3-lesson series, and this final one was this one here. And I find it to be an interesting concept about people who aren't in a younger class. And I chose specifically, we've been trying to find for the last few months a time to work this in on our Wednesday evening schedule for us. And it just so happened that recently we went back to our regular classes here at East Hill. And I thought that was a fine time to think about this lesson because they're not in here. Now, what I want you to do is some homework. It'll be real easy. You can do this. I'm glad that I get to assign homework on a lesson I didn't present. I want you to find one young person. I don't care how old they are. And follow out this lesson. That might be a longer commitment, maybe. Some of them are younger. No matter what their age, find a young person here and be a Paul. If you need further study, you can go to Titus chapter 2 and look at verses 1 through 4, where the sound men and the aged women, the sound women, are to do the very thing that's described. It's interesting to me that Paul does this for Timothy and for Titus too, but he writes in Titus chapter 2 about how the rest of the church is supposed to be doing that. So here's your homework. Find someone. Maybe they're in our 2- and 3-year-old class, or maybe they're in our baby class. Maybe they're in kindergarten. That's a longer commitment, I know. But what would the church look like if the church was like Paul? I find that to be interesting, or like what happens in Titus chapter 2, verses 1 through 6. Specifically in verses 2 and verse 3, the aged men and the aged women. If they reached into those classifications of people to help those that are younger. Number 2, I want you to think about this. I want you to think about something that I thought was important in the lesson. By the way, I'll give you a moment to think about this, and you may not have an answer, so that's okay, but what did you think was the most important part of the lesson? Anybody got an opinion? I know I'm short noticing you. But I'll tell you what mine is if you don't have one. Anybody got one? I'll tell you what mine is. It's the fact that he mentions that we can't do this by ourselves. One person can't reach out to every young person, but all of us can reach out to every young person. By the way, it's reinforcing this very idea. The only 2 in that age bracket that we know of that Paul reached out to was Timothy and Titus. Thus, you have these 2 letters written to them, and they're in that same age bracket. And by the way, both of those letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and the book of Titus, they're called sometimes the pastoral epistles. And now that name is given for a variety of reasons, but the reason that they're called that is because they carry the same content within them. And interesting to me is Paul is writing to the 2 that are in that same age bracket. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but there would have been more than 2 in that age bracket in Paul's day. There would have been more than 2 in that age bracket in the church during the time we're reading about in 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Therefore, by very extension, Paul did not reach out to every person, but yet the church is supposed to reach within its own walls. By the way, that's one of the greatest works within the church. We often think about the work of the church being out, leave the doors, go do something. And oftentimes we forget about the work that's within. And many times when it comes to that educational wing, we really don't think about it unless we're A, teaching, or B, we're the one that rings the bell. But just think about that. Paul, he only had 2 that we're aware of. Now, there may have been others. But I know these 3 letters were written to 2 individuals to be that person to help them out. So I really hope that this lesson was enjoyable to you. I hope it gives you something to think about. Now, at this point in time, I've seen this lesson 6 times. So hopefully, you will be able to find something in that. If you'd like a copy of it, just let the office know. No, we'll have to make them. We've not done that at all. We only have them in digital formats. But if you'd like a copy of it, you just let the office know. Maybe the best way you can do that tonight is put that on your attendance card. That way we will know to make those or not, and we will get those together for you. So I hope this lesson has been good for you. We have right now about 1.5 minutes, and I'm not going to sit up here and just make things up for the rest of the minute. We'll have that time, and then in just a moment, our young people will be in here for our devotional period.